The billionaire told her not to fall for him, but melted the moment she said his name. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She knew she should have stayed home that night, but destiny rarely asks for permission. Isla Montgomery adjusted the camera strap across her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight that had become as natural as breathing. The cobblestone streets of Charleston's historic district gleamed under the amber glow of gas lamps, still damp from the afternoon rain that had painted the city in shades of gold and grey. At 27, she had photographed hundreds of events, but tonight felt different, though she couldn't quite place why. The Ashley River Hotel rose before her like something from a dream, its antebellum facade draped in Spanish moss and soft lighting. She paused at the entrance, watching well-dressed guests drift through the doors like elegant ghosts from another era. The assignment was simple: capture the essence of a private reception for Charleston's elite. What could be simpler? "You must be the photographer," a voice called from behind her. Isla turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching, adorned in pearls that caught the lamplight. "Mrs. Whitmore, I presume. Thank you for hiring me for tonight." "Oh, darling, you come highly recommended. Just capture the magic. You know how these old Charleston families love their traditions." Mrs. Whitmore's smile was warm but hurried. "The reception's already begun. Follow the music." Inside, the hotel's grand ballroom transported Isla to a world she observed but never quite belonged to. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across cream-colored walls, while conversations flowed as smoothly as the champagne being served on silver trays. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, her camera capturing candid moments, a grandmother's proud smile as she watched her granddaughter dance, the gentle way a couple's hands found each other across a table, the quiet laughter shared between old friends. But it was in the hallway between the ballroom and the garden terrace that her world shifted. She was adjusting her camera settings when footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Isla looked up to find herself face to face with a man who seemed to command the very air around him. Tall, with dark hair that showed hints of silver at the temples, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being watched, and to watching in return. Their eyes met, and for a moment the distant music faded into background noise. "You're not enjoying the party," he observed, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested New York origins softened by Southern living. "I'm working," Isla replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Parties look different through a lens." "Adrian Vale," he introduced himself, extending a hand that was warm and firm in hers. "Isla Montgomery." Something about the way he said her name back to her, testing it like a new melody, made her pulse quicken. They stood there in the hallway, the sounds of celebration muffled around them. He studied her with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail, the way she held her camera protectively, how she shifted her weight slightly from one foot to the other, the small scar above her left eyebrow that most people never noticed. "You photograph people," he said, not quite a question. "I capture moments," she corrected, "the spaces between words, the looks people think no one sees." A smile ghosted across his lips, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Dangerous work. Before she could ask what he meant, he stepped closer, close enough that she caught the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, meant only for her. "Don't fall in love with me." The words hung between them like a challenge wrapped in a warning. Most women might have been offended, confused or intrigued by such an unusual introduction. But Isla Montgomery wasn't most women. She had spent years learning to read between the lines, to see what people revealed when they thought no one was looking. She met his gaze steadily, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Is that a request or a dare, Mr. Vale?" Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Before he could answer, the sound of Mrs. Whitmore's voice calling her name drifted from the ballroom. "I should get back to work," Isla said, taking a step backward. "Of course." Adrian moved aside, but his eyes never left her face. As she walked away, camera in hand, Isla felt the weight of his gaze following her. She didn't look back, but somehow she knew he was still watching. And somewhere deep in her chest, something had awakened, something that whispered this was only the beginning. Behind her, Adrian Vale stood in the empty hallway, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his carefully controlled life. And for the first time in years, he found himself hoping that someone would ignore his warning entirely. What would you do if someone warned you not to fall in love with them the moment you met? Would you see it as a red flag, or the most honest thing anyone has ever told you? 3 days later, Ela discovered that Charleston had suddenly become a very small city. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Café du Monde in the French Quarter, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. Ela had claimed her usual corner table, the one that offered the perfect balance of natural light and privacy for editing her photos. Her laptop displayed the images from the reception, moments frozen in time that told stories of laughter, connection, and old Charleston elegance. She was adjusting the exposure on a particularly beautiful shot of an elderly couple dancing when a familiar voice cut through the gentle hum of conversation. The lighting in that one is exceptional. Her fingers froze over the trackpad. Without looking up, she knew exactly who stood beside her table. The scent of his cologne, subtle but unmistakable, had already given him away. "Mr. Vale," she said, finally raising her eyes to meet his. "Fancy meeting you here." Adrian stood with a coffee cup in one hand and what appeared to be a genuine smile, the first real one she'd seen from him. He wore a simple navy sweater that made his eyes seem darker, more intense. "May I?" He gestured to the empty chair across from her. "It's a free country," Isla replied, though she quickly minimized the photo editing window. Something about having him see her work felt too intimate, too revealing. He sat down with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in any environment, from boardrooms to coffee shops. "You come here often?" "Every Tuesday and Thursday. The light is perfect for editing, and they make the best beignets outside of New Orleans." She paused, studying his face. "What about you? This doesn't exactly seem like your usual scene. And what would you assume is my usual scene?" There was amusement in his voice, as if he already knew her answer. "Corner offices with floor-to-ceiling windows, restaurants where the menu doesn't have prices, places where people speak in quarterly projections and market analyses." Adrian laughed, a genuine warm sound that transformed his entire face. "You're not entirely wrong, but I've been coming here for 2 years. Every Tuesday and Thursday." He took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim of his cup. "Funny how we've never crossed paths before." Isla felt something flutter in her chest, surprise mixed with something she didn't want to name. 2 years. Table by the window, usually. I prefer to watch the street while I work." He gestured toward the front of the cafe, where his laptop bag sat beside a table she now realized she'd seen occupied by the same person every week. "I've noticed you, though. The photographer who turns every ordinary moment into art." Heat crept up her neck. "You've been watching me?" "Not watching," he corrected, his voice softer now. "Noticing. There's a difference." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of that admission settling between them. Isla found herself studying his hands as he cradled his coffee cup. Strong, elegant fingers that looked like they could be equally comfortable signing million-dollar contracts or handling something delicate. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Depends on the question. The other night, when you warned me not to fall in love with you, was that your standard introduction to women, or was I special?" Adrian set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. When he looked at her, something had shifted in his expression, a guardedness that reminded her of the man she'd first met in that hotel hallway. "Neither," he said quietly. "It was honesty." Honesty about what? He was quiet for so long that Isla wondered if he would answer at all. Outside, the morning bustle of Charleston continued. Tourists taking pictures of historic buildings, locals heading to work, street musicians setting up for the day. Normal life carrying on while she sat across from a man who seemed to exist in his own carefully constructed world. "I'm not good at letting people close," he said finally. "I've built a life that works because it has boundaries, clear lines, rules. And falling in love breaks the rules. Falling in love destroys everything." The words came out harder than he seemed to intend. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him seem younger, more vulnerable. "I've seen what it does to people. The chaos, the loss of control, the inevitable disappointment when reality doesn't match the fantasy." Isla leaned back in her chair, processing his words. "That's a pretty cynical view of love. It's a realistic view of love. Or maybe," she said carefully, "it's the view of someone who's never experienced the real thing." Something flashed in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or recognition. "And you have?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Isla thought of her last relationship, which had ended not in heartbreak but in a slow fade of indifference. She thought of the careful distance she maintained in her own life, how she captured other people's intimate moments, but rarely allowed herself to be truly seen. "No," she admitted, "but I haven't given up on the possibility." Adrian studied her for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Most people would have walked away by now, after what I said at the reception." "Most people probably would have," Isla agreed, "but I'm not most people." "No," he said quietly. "You're not." Her phone buzzed against the table, a text from a client about a wedding shoot next weekend. As she glanced at it, Adrian stood up. "I should let you get back to your work," he said, but he didn't move to leave. "Will I see you here Thursday?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Probably," he said, that almost smile returning. "Coincidences seem to be following us around lately." As he walked toward the door, Isla called after him softly, "Adrian?" He turned back, and she saw something unguarded in his expression for just a moment. "Maybe the universe doesn't believe in your rules." He stood there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if her words had stopped him mid-step. Then, without another word, he walked out into the Charleston morning, leaving Isla with her coffee, her photos, and the growing certainty that some coincidences were actually destiny wearing a disguise. And she wondered if Adrian Vale was about to discover that some rules were meant to be broken. Some people run to clear their minds. Isla ran to quiet the voices that had been whispering Adrian's name since Tuesday. The waterfront park stretched before her in the pre-dawn darkness, a ribbon of green that hugged the Ashley River like an old friend. At 5:30 a.m., Charleston belonged to early risers and insomniacs, joggers with reflective gear, dog walkers nursing travel mugs of coffee, and the occasional photographer chasing the perfect sunrise shot. Isla's footsteps echoed rhythmically against the paved path, her breath visible in the cool October air. She'd been running this route for 3 years, ever since she'd moved to Charleston, and discovered that watching the sun rise over the water was better than any meditation app. But this morning felt different. Her mind kept drifting to dark eyes and careful words, to the way Adrian had looked at her when she challenged his rules about love. She rounded the curve near the fishing pier, her pace steady and meditative, when she saw him. Adrian Vale stood at the railing, perfectly still, watching the horizon where the first hints of gold were beginning to paint the edges of night. He wore dark running clothes that made him blend into the shadows, and for a moment, Isla wondered if she was seeing things, if thinking about him so much had conjured him from her imagination. But then he turned at the sound of her approaching footsteps, and she knew he was real. Real and somehow here, at her sanctuary, at the exact moment when the world balanced between darkness and light. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, slowing to a stop a few feet away from him. "What is?" His voice carried easily in the quiet morning air. "These coincidences. First the cafe, now this. Do you run here often too?" Adrian's mouth quirked up at one corner. "Every morning, 5:15 sharp." He gestured toward the eastern horizon, where the sky was beginning to bloom with soft colors. "Best time to think, before the world starts demanding answers to questions you're not ready to ask." Despite herself, Isla smiled. "That's almost poetic, Mr. Vale." "Almost poetic is the best I can do before sunrise," he replied. "What about you? Let me guess, you're here for the light." "I'm here to run," she said, though they both knew it wasn't the complete truth. "The light is just a bonus." They stood side by side at the railing now, watching as the sun crept higher, painting the water in shades of amber and rose. A pelican glided past them, its wings barely moving as it skimmed the river's surface. In the distance, the bells of St. Michael's Church began their morning call. "It's beautiful," Isla murmured, then immediately felt foolish for stating something so obvious. "It is," Adrian agreed, but when she glanced at him, he wasn't looking at the sunrise. He was looking at her. Heat flooded her cheeks, and she turned back to the water. "Do you always stare at people instead of scenery?" "Only when the person is more interesting than the scenery." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither seemed ready to fully acknowledge. Isla felt her heart doing something complicated in her chest, a rhythm that had nothing to do with her morning run. "Adrian," she said quietly, "what are you really afraid of?" He was silent for so long that she wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid of wanting something I can't control." He paused, his hands gripping the railing until his knuckles showed white. "I'm afraid of becoming someone I don't recognize, someone who makes decisions based on feelings instead of logic." "And you think that's what love does?" "I know it is." He turned to face her fully, and she saw something raw and honest in his expression. "My father built an empire, and then lost everything chasing after a woman who didn't love him back. My business partner destroyed a 20-year friendship over a marriage that lasted 8 months. I've watched rational, intelligent people become strangers to themselves because they confused desire with destiny. Isla absorbed this, understanding now where his careful walls had come from. So you decided never to risk it. I decided to build a life that couldn't be destroyed by someone else's choices. That sounds lonely, she said softly. Lonely is safe. They watched another pelican join the first, the two birds moving in perfect synchronization across the water. The sun was fully visible now, a golden orb that turned the Ashley River into liquid light. What if, Isla said carefully, what if love doesn't have to be destructive? What if it could be additive instead of subtractive? Adrian looked at her with something that might have been hope, quickly suppressed. You really believe that? I want to, she admitted. I want to believe that the right person doesn't take away pieces of who you are. They help you discover pieces you never knew existed. The right person, he repeated, as if testing the words. Someone who sees your walls and doesn't try to tear them down. Someone who just sits beside them until you decide to open the gate yourself. Something shifted in Adrian's face, a crack in his carefully constructed armor. For a moment, Isla thought he might say something that would change everything between them. Instead, he checked his watch. I should head back, he said, but his voice sounded different, softer. Conference call with Tokyo in an hour. Of course. Isla stepped back, giving him space to leave, but he didn't move. Isla. Her name on his lips sounded like a question and an answer at the same time. Yes, thank you, for not trying to fix me. Before she could respond, he was walking away, his long strides carrying him back toward the city streets. Isla remained at the railing, watching his retreating figure until he disappeared around a bend in the path. The sun was fully up now, painting Charleston in warm, golden tones that made everything look possible. As she began her run back home, Isla realized that something fundamental had shifted. Adrian had shown her a glimpse behind his walls, and she had offered him something in return, acceptance without expectation, and for the first time since their first meeting, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the universe knew exactly what it was doing when it kept putting them in each other's path. Some coincidences, she thought as her feet found their rhythm again, were just love learning how to introduce itself. There are moments when the universe stops being subtle and starts being obvious. Saturday morning in Harleston Village bloomed with the kind of autumn energy that made Charleston feel like a small town instead of a city. The farmers' market stretched along the tree-lined streets, vendors arranging their displays under white tents, while early shoppers moved through the aisles with canvas bags and careful deliberation. Isla loved this ritual, the way people touched peaches to test their ripeness, how couples debated the merits of heirloom tomatoes, the gentle chaos of community life unfolding in real time. She was examining a display of sunflowers, their faces turned toward the morning light like nature's own solar panels, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. The key is finding the ones that aren't trying too hard to be perfect. Isla turned slowly, half convinced she was imagining things again, but there was Adrian, crouched beside a collection of white peonies, his attention focused on the blooms with the same intensity she'd seen him apply to their conversations. He wore jeans and a simple grey Henley, casual clothes that somehow made him seem more approachable, more human. "Are you following me, Mr. Vale?" she asked, though her tone held more amusement than accusation. He looked up, and she caught something almost sheepish in his expression. "Would you believe me if I said I was just shopping for flowers?" "That depends. Are you?" Adrian straightened, a single white peony in his hand. "I am, actually. My housekeeper, Dolores, has been with me for 15 years. Tomorrow is her birthday, and she's always complaining that I never notice the flowers in my own garden." The image of this carefully controlled billionaire shopping for birthday flowers for his housekeeper was so unexpectedly sweet that Isla felt something warm unfold in her chest. White peonies are a good choice. They mean honor and compassion. You know the language of flowers. Occupational hazard. You spend enough time photographing weddings and anniversaries, you pick up a few things. She moved closer to examine his selection. "But that one's a little too perfect. See how all the petals are uniform? It'll look forced in an arrangement." She reached past him to select a different bloom, one with petals that varied slightly in size, with edges that were just beginning to show the faintest hint of pink. As she did, her fingers brushed against his, and she felt that familiar flutter of electricity. "This one," she said softly, "has character." Adrian took the flower from her, his fingers lingering against hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Character," he repeated as if testing the word. Perfection is overrated, Isla said, stepping back to a safer distance. The most beautiful things have flaws that make them unique. Something in the way she said it made Adrian look at her more closely. Is that your philosophy about flowers or about life? Both. They moved through the market together after that. Not quite side by side, but not apart either. Adrian proved to be a surprisingly thoughtful shopper, asking vendors about their growing methods and listening carefully to their answers. Isla found herself seeing him in a new light, not the imposing figure from the hotel reception, but someone who took time to choose the right flowers for someone he cared about. At the bread vendor's stall, they both reached for the same loaf of sourdough. Their hands collided over the crusty brown bread, and they both laughed, real unguarded laughter that drew curious glances from other shoppers. "You take it," Adrian said. "No, you were here first." "I insist." "So do I." They stood there in a ridiculous standoff over bread, smiling at each other like teenagers, until the vendor, a woman in her 60s with flour-dusted hands, cleared her throat. "Why don't you just share it?" she suggested, with the practical wisdom of someone who'd watched too many people complicate simple things. Adrian and Isla looked at each other, then at the bread, then back at each other. "I suppose that would be logical," Adrian said slowly. "Very practical," Isla agreed, but neither of them moved to take the bread. "Of course," Adrian continued, "sharing would require us to see each other again to actually share it." "That's true," Isla said, her pulse quickening. "It would be a shame to waste good bread." The vendor rolled her eyes good-naturedly and wrapped the loaf in brown paper. "Young people," she muttered, "making everything complicated." As they walked away from the stall, the shared loaf tucked under Adrian's arm, Isla felt as if they'd crossed some invisible line. It was just bread, but somehow it felt like more, like a small commitment, a reason to see each other that had nothing to do with coincidence. "So," Adrian said as they paused near the edge of the market, "when should we share this bread?" "Tomorrow," Isla suggested. "I could make coffee to go with it." "I make better coffee," Adrian said, then immediately looked surprised at his own boldness. "Is that an invitation?" He was quiet for a moment, and Isla could almost see him weighing options, calculating risks. Finally he said, "My place has a view of the harbor. Sunday morning, 9 o'clock?" "Are you sure?" Isla asked gently. "I don't want you to feel pressured to—" Isla, the way he said her name, stopped her mid-sentence. "I'm sure." He pulled out his phone and typed quickly, then showed her the screen, his address in the historic district along with his phone number. "Just in case you get lost," he said. "Just in case," she agreed, entering the information into her own phone. As they prepared to part ways, Adrian hesitated. "Isla, what I said before about not falling in love with me, yes? I'm starting to think that warning was meant for me, not you." Before she could process the full meaning of his words, he was walking away, leaving her standing in the morning sun with a racing heart and the growing certainty that tomorrow's coffee would change everything. And as she watched him disappear into the crowd, Isla realized that some invitations were really just love finding the courage to ask for a chance. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Isla stood on the sidewalk outside 42 East Bay Street, clutching the sourdough bread like a lifeline, and wondering if she was about to make a beautiful mistake. Adrian's house rose before her, a pristine example of Charleston's antebellum architecture, with its signature double-story piazza, and intricate ironwork that spoke of old money and older secrets. The morning sun cast long shadows across the historic brick, and she could hear the distant sound of church bells calling the city to worship. She'd changed clothes 3 times that morning, finally settling on a simple sundress the color of sea glass and her grandmother's pearl earrings. Nothing too formal, nothing that suggested she was trying too hard, but something that made her feel confident and authentically herself. Before she could second-guess herself again, the front door opened. Adrian appeared in the doorway, and Isla felt her breath catch. Gone was the carefully pressed businessman from their previous encounters. Instead, he wore dark jeans and a white button-down shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, the top 2 buttons undone. His hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and there was something vulnerable about seeing him in his own space. "You came," he said, and she heard genuine surprise in his voice. "You invited me," she replied. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might come to your senses and realize this was a bad idea." Isla held up the bread. "Too late now, we have a commitment to this sourdough." That earned her a real smile, the kind that transformed his entire face, and made her understand why he kept such careful control over his expressions. When Adrian Vale smiled like that, he was devastating. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. The interior of the house was nothing like what she'd expected. Instead of the cold, museum-like perfection she'd imagined, the space felt warm and lived in. Exposed brick walls were lined with bookshelves that actually looked red, not decorative. Soft leather furniture was arranged to encourage conversation rather than impress. Art, real art, not expensive pieces chosen by a designer, hung at eye level where it could actually be appreciated. "This is beautiful," Isla said, meaning it. "It's home," Adrian replied, and something in the way he said it suggested that distinction mattered to him. He led her through a hallway lined with windows that showcased the garden, not the formal, manicured landscape she'd expected, but something wilder, more natural. White peonies bloomed alongside jasmine and climbing roses, creating a tapestry of green and white that looked like it had grown by accident rather than design. "Dolores's handiwork," Adrian explained, catching her gaze. "She says, formal gardens have no soul. Smart woman. The smartest. She's been trying to civilize me for 15 years. The kitchen, when they reached it, was the heart of the house, a perfect blend of modern functionality and historic charm. Subway tiles gleamed white against dark wood cabinets, and a massive farmhouse sink sat beneath a window that offered an unobstructed view of Charleston Harbor. The morning light streaming through made everything feel golden and possible. "You weren't lying about the harbor view," Isla said, moving to the window. "I never lie," Adrian replied, busy with an elaborate coffee machine that looked like it belonged in a European cafe. "I may omit things or present selective truths, but I don't lie." "Good to know." She watched him work, noting the careful precision with which he measured coffee grounds, the way he adjusted the machine's settings, with the attention of someone who'd perfected this ritual. "How do you take your coffee?" "Strong, black, no distractions." "Of course you do." Isla laughed. "I should have guessed. What about you?" "Cream, 1 sugar. Sweet enough to be optimistic, but not so sweet that I can't handle reality." Adrian paused in his coffee preparation to look at her. That might be the most honest thing anyone's ever said about coffee preferences. Coffee preferences say a lot about a person. What does mine say about me? Isla considered this, studying his profile as he returned to the coffee machine. That you like things uncomplicated. That you don't trust anything that's been dressed up to hide its true nature. That you'd rather have the bitter truth than a beautiful lie. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Surprise, recognition, maybe both. "And what does yours say about you?" "That I believe most things are better when they're balanced. That a little sweetness can make even difficult truths easier to swallow. That I'm an optimist, but I'm not naive." They stood in comfortable silence while the coffee brewed, the morning harbor sounds drifting through the open window. A pelican flew past, and Isla smiled, remembering their conversation at the waterfront. "Tell me something," she said softly. "Why did you really invite me here?" Adrian's hands stilled on the coffee cups. For a long moment he didn't answer, and Isla wondered if she'd pushed too far, too fast. "Because," he said finally, his voice so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him, "for the first time in years, I wanted to show someone who I am when I'm not performing." The honesty in his words hit her like a wave. She understood suddenly what this invitation really meant. Not just coffee and shared bread, but a glimpse behind the walls he'd spent years building. "And who are you when you're not performing?" she asked. Adrian turned to face her fully, and she saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes. "I don't know anymore. I've been playing the part for so long, I'm not sure where Adrian Vale, the businessman, ends, and Adrian Vale, the person, begins." "Maybe," Isla said gently. "That's something worth figuring out." The coffee machine beeped, breaking the moment, but something fundamental had shifted between them. As Adrian poured their coffee and Isla sliced the bread, she realized they were no longer two people carefully circling each other. They were two people beginning to trust each other with their real selves. And that, she thought, as she accepted her perfectly prepared cup of coffee, was far more dangerous than falling in love. That was the beginning of actually knowing someone. The most important conversations happen in the silences between sentences. They moved to the piazza with their coffee and bread, settling into wicker chairs that had been weathered to a perfect shade of grey by years of Charleston sun and salt air. The harbor stretched before them like a watercolor painting, dotted with sailboats and fishing vessels that moved with the unhurried rhythm of a Sunday morning. Spanish moss draped from the live oak in the garden below, swaying gently in the breeze that carried the scent of jasmine and possibility. Isla tucked one leg beneath her, cradling her coffee cup in both hands. The morning light caught the highlights in her hair, and Adrian found himself studying the way her expressions shifted like weather, thoughtful one moment, amused the next, always genuine. "This bread is incredible," she said, taking another bite of the sourdough they'd warmed in his oven. "Dolores would say good bread is like good people. It takes time to develop real character." She sounds wise. She is. She's also the only person who's ever told me I was being an idiot and lived to tell about it. Adrian's mouth quirked up at the memory. Multiple times, actually. What did you do that was so idiotic? Adrian considered deflecting with humor, the way he usually did when conversations ventured toward personal territory, but something about the morning light, or the way Isla waited without pushing, made him want to be honest. "I fired my best architect because he disagreed with me on a project design," he said quietly. "This was about 5 years ago. The man had been with my company for 8 years, had designed some of our most successful developments, but I was so convinced I was right that I couldn't hear his valid concerns. What happened? The project failed, spectacularly, cost me $12 million and nearly destroyed a historic neighborhood in Savannah." Adrian stared out at the harbor, remembering the weight of that failure. "Dolores found me in my office at 2 in the morning, surrounded by paperwork, trying to figure out how to fix something that couldn't be fixed. What did she say? She looked at me and said, 'Mr. Adrian, being smart isn't the same as being wise. Smart people think they have all the answers. Wise people know which questions to ask.'" Isla was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Did you hire the architect back?" "I tried. He'd already taken a position with a firm in Seattle, can't say I blamed him." Adrian took a sip of his coffee, tasting the bitterness he'd learned to prefer. "That's when I started building my rules. Clear boundaries, limited emotional investment, decisions based on data rather than instinct." "Sounds lonely." "Lonely was safe," he said, echoing their conversation from the waterfront. "Or so I thought." A pelican landed on the railing of the piazza, regarding them with ancient, knowing eyes before spreading its wings and gliding toward the water. They watched it disappear into the morning haze, and Isla found herself thinking about the distance between safety and isolation. "Can I tell you something?" she said softly. "Please, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about your warning being meant for you instead of me." She turned in her chair to face him more directly. "I think maybe we've both been protecting ourselves from the wrong things." "What do you mean?" Isla set down her coffee cup and looked out at the harbor, gathering her thoughts. "I've spent 3 years in Charleston, photographing other people's love stories, other people's connections, other people's moments of joy. I've convinced myself that I was this independent artist who didn't need those things, who was complete on my own. Aren't you? I thought I was. But sitting here with you, sharing bread and talking about failures and wisdom, I'm realizing that maybe I've been just as scared as you are, just in a different way." Adrian studied her profile, noting the slight tremor in her voice, the way her fingers played with the handle of her coffee cup. "Scared of what?" "Of wanting something enough that losing it would break me." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for years. "Of caring so much about someone that their opinion of me could change who I am. Of falling in love with someone who might wake up one day and decide I'm not worth the effort." The honesty in her admission hit Adrian like a physical force. He'd expected her to be different from him, braver, more open, less damaged by life's disappointments. To discover that she carried her own fears, her own careful walls, made her somehow more real and infinitely more precious. "Isla," he said quietly. "I know it's ironic," she continued, not quite ready to meet his eyes. "The photographer who captures intimate moments but won't let herself have them, the woman who sees beauty in imperfection but thinks she has to be perfect to be loved. You don't," Adrian said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. "Don't what?" "Have to be perfect." He leaned forward in his chair, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "You're not perfect, Isla. You're real. You're honest about your fears. You challenge my assumptions and make me want to be a better version of myself. That's not perfection. That's something far more valuable." She finally looked at him then, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. Not sad tears, but the kind that came from being truly seen and accepted. "What are we doing, Adrian?" she whispered. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never been here before." "Me neither." They sat in the space between words, between fear and hope, between the people they'd been protecting themselves from becoming and the people they might be brave enough to be together. The morning sun climbed higher, painting everything in warm, golden light that made even uncertainty feel beautiful. Maybe, Adrian said finally, we don't have to figure it all out today. Maybe we just have to be brave enough to keep showing up, to keep sharing bread and coffee and honest conversations, to keep letting each other see who we are when we're not performing. As if by mutual agreement, they both reached for the last piece of bread at the same time. Their fingers touched, and neither pulled away. Instead, they broke the piece in half, each taking a portion, the simple act feeling like a promise neither was quite ready to name. And in that moment, surrounded by the sounds of Charleston waking up around them, they both realized they were no longer just two people afraid of falling in love. They were two people who might already be falling, and for the first time, that felt less like a warning and more like a gift. Some moments arrive with the weight of destiny, announcing themselves not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty that everything is about to change. The week following their Sunday morning coffee passed in a blur of stolen glances and carefully casual encounters. Adrian appeared at Café du Monde every Tuesday and Thursday, no longer pretending it was coincidence. Isla found herself taking longer routes through downtown, past the sleek glass building where his company occupied the top 3 floors. They were circling each other like dancers, learning a new rhythm, neither quite ready to name what was happening between them. Friday evening found Isla at Marion Square, camera in hand, capturing the golden hour light as it filtered through the trees. She'd been hired to photograph a small outdoor wedding. Nothing elaborate, just 2 college sweethearts who'd decided they couldn't wait any longer to start their lives together. The simplicity of it, the pure joy on their faces, made her think of authentic love versus performed love, of the difference between connection and transaction. She was adjusting her lens for a shot of the couple's first dance when she felt someone watching her. The awareness prickled along her spine before she turned to see Adrian standing at the edge of the square, hands in his pockets, observing her work with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He wore a dark suit that suggested he'd come from the office, but his tie was loosened and his sleeves were rolled up, small concessions to the informal setting that somehow made him more approachable. When their eyes met across the scattered wedding guests, he smiled that rare, unguarded smile that never failed to make her heart skip. Isla finished her shot, then walked over to where he stood beneath a centuries-old live oak. "Fancy meeting you here," she said, echoing their first cafe encounter. "I was walking back to my car when I heard the music," Adrian replied. "I looked over and saw you working. You have this expression when you're behind the camera, completely focused, like nothing else in the world exists. It's called concentration. It's called passion," he corrected gently. "There's a difference." Heat rose in her cheeks. "Are you analyzing me, Mr. Vale?" "Always," he said without apology. "You're the most interesting subject I've ever encountered." Before she could respond, the wedding photographer, a friend of Isla's who'd hired her as a second shooter, called her name. The couple was ready for their sunset portraits. "I should get back," Isla said, though she made no move to leave. "I'll wait." "You don't have to." "Isla." The way he said her name stopped her protest. "I'll wait." The next 30 minutes passed in a haze of golden light and stolen glances. Isla worked with professional efficiency, capturing the couple's joy as they posed against the backdrop of Charleston's historic charm, but she was hyper-aware of Adrian's presence, of the way he leaned against the tree and watched her move through her craft with what looked like genuine admiration. When the session wrapped and the couple had wandered off to their reception, Isla found herself alone with Adrian as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. "Walk with me?" he asked, and she nodded without hesitation. They strolled through the square in comfortable silence, past families packing up picnic blankets and couples sharing bottles of wine on park benches. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of a jazz trio performing somewhere nearby. "That couple," Adrian said finally, "how long do you think they'll last?" "Forever," Isla replied without hesitation. "You sound certain." "I am. Did you see the way they looked at each other? Not just during the ceremony, but when they thought no one was watching. He tied her shoe when the lace came undone, and she fixed his boutonniere without him asking. They take care of each other without thinking about it." Adrian was quiet for several steps. "You believe in forever?" "I believe in the possibility of forever," Isla corrected. "I believe some people find their person and choose to keep choosing them every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. And how do you know when you found your person? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to address directly. Isla thought about her answer carefully, aware that whatever she said would matter more than simple conversation. I think, she said slowly, you know when being with them feels like coming home to yourself, when they see all your broken pieces and your sharp edges, and instead of trying to fix you or change you, they just fit alongside you perfectly. Adrian stopped walking. They were beside the fountain in the center of the square, where water danced in the evening light and the sounds of the city felt distant and dreamlike. Isla, he said, and there was something different in his voice, something vulnerable and urgent and terrifying. Yes, I need to tell you something. Her heart began to beat faster. Okay. These past few weeks, spending time with you, talking to you, it's been the most honest I've been with another person in years. Maybe ever. He ran a hand through his hair, that gesture she'd come to recognize as his tell when he was struggling with something. You make me want to be the kind of man who's brave enough to choose someone every day, who's brave enough to let someone choose him. Adrian, she whispered, his name a prayer and a plea. I know I told you not to fall in love with me, he continued, stepping closer, but I'm starting to think I might not have a choice about falling in love with you. The words hit her like a wave, washing away every careful defense she'd built. She saw in his eyes the same fear and hope that lived in her own heart, the same desperate wish to be known and chosen and loved, despite all the reasons it might be dangerous. What if we're both scared? She asked softly. Then we'll be scared together. What if we mess this up? Then we'll figure out how to fix it together. The fountain sparkled behind them, and somewhere in the distance, the jazz trio played something slow and sweet. Other couples walked hand in hand through the square, lost in their own worlds, but Isla felt as if she and Adrian existed in a bubble of possibility, balanced on the edge of everything changing. Adrian, she said, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the slight roughness of stubble against her palm. Tell me what you're thinking, he said, leaning into her touch. I'm thinking that maybe the scariest thing isn't falling in love, she whispered. Maybe the scariest thing is not being brave enough to try. Something shifted in his expression, relief and determination, and something that looked like wonder. He covered her hand with his, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. Then let's be brave, he said. And in that moment, with Charleston's golden light fading around them and the promise of everything unknown stretching ahead, they both realized they had already made their choice. They were going to fall, together, and trust that love would teach them how to fly. There are conversations that happen without words, truths that can only be spoken through the whisper of skin against skin. The rain began as they walked back toward Adrian's car, fat drops that splattered against the pavement and sent couples scurrying for cover under shop awnings and restaurant umbrellas. But Isla and Adrian moved through it as if they existed in their own weather system, their hands finding each other naturally as they navigated the suddenly slick, cobblestone streets. My car's just around the corner, Adrian said, though he made no move to quicken their pace. I don't mind the rain, Isla replied, and she meant it. The drops caught in her hair like diamonds, and the evening air smelled of petrichor and possibility. By the time they reached his BMW, they were both laughing and breathless, their clothes damp, but their spirits light. Adrian fumbled with his keys, distracted by the way water droplets clung to Isla's eyelashes, how her dress had turned a shade darker and clung to curves he'd been trying not to notice for weeks. You're soaked, he said, finally managing to unlock the doors. So are you, she pointed out, noting how his white shirt had become nearly transparent in places, revealing the strong lines of his chest and shoulders. They stood there in the rain, car doors open but neither moving to get inside, caught in a moment that felt suspended between what was and what could be. Water dripped from Adrian's hair onto his forehead, and without thinking, Isla reached up to brush it away. The simple touch ignited something between them, a current that had been building for weeks finally finding its ground. Adrian's hand came up to cover hers, where it rested against his cheek, his eyes never leaving her face. Isla, he said, her name barely audible over the sound of rain on pavement. I know, she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. We should get out of the rain. We should, but neither of them moved. Instead, Adrian's free hand came up to frame her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a gentleness that made her breath catch. The rain fell around them like a curtain, creating a private world where only they existed. I've been thinking about what you said, he murmured, his voice rough with something that sounded like wonder. About finding your person. What about it? I think I understand now. What it means to feel like you're coming home to yourself. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Isla felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the last of her careful defenses crumbling in the face of the honesty in his eyes. Adrian, come home with me, he said softly. Not for anything except just to be together, to keep talking, to keep figuring this out. The invitation was wrapped in vulnerability, free of expectation or pressure. It was an offer of companionship, of continued connection, of choosing each other for whatever came next. Yes, she said, the word simple and sure. The drive to his house passed in comfortable quiet, the rain drumming against the windows while classical music played softly from the speakers. Adrian's hand rested on the gear shift, close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of his skin. Every few minutes their eyes would meet in the reflection of passing streetlights, and Isla felt as if they were having an entire conversation in those silent glances. At his house, Adrian gave her one of his shirts to change into while he put her dress in the dryer. The shirt was soft and enormous on her, falling to mid-thigh and carrying the subtle scent of his cologne. When she emerged from the bathroom, she found him in the kitchen, also changed into dry clothes, jeans and a grey Henley that made his eyes look darker. "Better?" he asked, and she nodded, suddenly shy in his clothing, in his space, with the weight of everything unspoken between them. Much. He'd lit a fire in the living room fireplace, and the warm light danced across the brick walls and leather furniture. Rain continued to fall against the windows, making the house feel like a sanctuary from the outside world. They settled onto the couch, not quite touching, but close enough that the space between them hummed with possibility. Adrian poured them each a glass of wine, something red and complex that warmed her from the inside out. "Tell me something I don't know about you," Isla said, curling her legs beneath her. "What kind of something? Anything. A secret, a dream, something that makes you human." Adrian considered this, swirling his wine thoughtfully. "I'm terrified of flying." "Really? Panic attacks? Sweating? The whole thing? Which is ridiculous for someone who has to travel constantly for business." "What happened?" "Nothing dramatic. No crash, no traumatic experience. I just hate not being in control. Hate trusting my life to someone else's decisions." He gave her a rueful smile. "Ironic, considering what we're doing here." "What are we doing here?" "Learning to trust each other with pieces of ourselves we don't usually share." The honesty in his words made something flutter in her chest. "Your turn," he said. "Tell me something I don't know." Isla took a sip of wine, gathering courage. "I've never said I love you to anyone and meant it. Not romantically. Never. I've said the words, but they always felt like performance, like I was playing the role of someone in love rather than actually being in love." She met his eyes across the small space between them. "I always wondered what it would feel like to say those words and have them come from someplace real." Something shifted in Adrian's expression, understanding mixed with something that looked like longing. "And now?" "Now I think I'm beginning to understand the difference." They talked for hours as the fire burned low and the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows. About childhood dreams and adult disappointments, about the books that had shaped them and the places they wanted to see, about fear and hope and the strange alchemy that happened when two people decided to stop protecting themselves from each other. Somewhere around midnight, Isla found herself leaning against Adrian's shoulder, his arm around her in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. They weren't talking anymore, just watching the flames dance in the fireplace and listening to each other breathe. "Isla," Adrian said softly, his lips against her hair. "I want you to know something." She turned in his arms to look at him, noting the way the firelight caught the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "What?" "Whatever happens between us, however this ends, you've already changed me. You've shown me who I could be when I'm not afraid. That's a gift I'll never forget." Tears pricked at her eyes. Not sad tears, but the kind that came from being seen and valued so completely. "You've changed me too," she whispered. "How?" "You've shown me that love doesn't have to be something that diminishes you, that the right person doesn't make you smaller. They help you become more yourself than you ever thought possible." Adrian's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Isla." "I know," she said, understanding what he couldn't quite say yet. "Do you?" "I think we're both falling in love with each other, and it's terrifying and wonderful and nothing like either of us expected. And what do we do with that?" "We keep choosing each other," she said simply. One day at a time, one moment at a time. As if to demonstrate her point, she settled more firmly against his side, her head on his shoulder, her hand resting over his heart, where she could feel the steady rhythm that seemed to match her own. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean and preparing it for whatever tomorrow might bring. Inside, two people who had spent years protecting themselves from exactly this kind of connection held each other close and marveled at how safe it felt to finally stop running from love. And in the dying light of the fire, they both realized that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply stay. Some mornings arrive with the weight of reckoning, demanding answers to questions you've been avoiding for weeks. Isla woke to sunlight, streaming through unfamiliar windows and the distant sound of coffee brewing. For a moment she lay still, taking inventory. Adrian's shirt soft against her skin, the indent in the pillow beside her where his head had rested, the way the morning light painted his bedroom in shades of gold and possibility. They had fallen asleep on the couch sometime after 2, wrapped around each other like people who had been doing it for years, before Adrian had gently carried her to his room and settled beside her on top of the covers, both of them too emotionally raw and physically exhausted to do anything but hold each other. She found him in the kitchen, already dressed in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, his hair still damp from the shower. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and the smile that spread across his face was soft and unguarded and completely devastating. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the rough edge of sleep and something deeper. Morning. She was suddenly aware of how she must look, hair tousled, wearing his shirt, barefoot in his kitchen like this was something they did every day. "Coffee?" He held up a mug, already prepared the way she liked it. "You remembered," she said, accepting the warm ceramic and the brush of his fingers against hers. "I remember everything about you," he replied quietly, and the simple honesty of it made her heart skip. They stood in his kitchen as Charleston woke up around them, sharing coffee and the comfortable silence of people who had crossed some invisible line in the night. Through the window, the harbor sparkled in the morning sun, and Isla could see joggers and dog walkers beginning their daily routines along the waterfront. "I have a confession," Adrian said finally, leaning against the counter. "What kind of confession?" "I called in sick to work today." Isla nearly choked on her coffee. "You did what?" "I haven't taken a sick day in 4 years. But the thought of leaving you, of going back to meetings and spreadsheets and pretending that last night didn't happen," he shook his head. "I couldn't do it. Adrian Vale, playing hooky," she mused. "What would the business journals say? That I've finally lost my mind." His eyes met hers over his coffee cup, and they'd probably be right. "What do you want to do with your day of freedom?" "Show you Charleston, the parts tourists don't see. The places that made me fall in love with this city." The word love hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. But Isla felt its weight, felt the way it seemed to change the very air around them. "I'd like that," she said softly. An hour later, they were walking through the narrow streets of the French Quarter, Adrian playing tour guide to places he'd discovered during his years in the city. He showed her the tiny bookstore tucked behind a wrought iron gate, where the owner's cat served as the unofficial greeter, the hole-in-the-wall cafe where local artists gathered every morning to argue about everything from politics to the proper way to make grits, the hidden garden behind St. Philip's Church where Spanish moss created a natural cathedral and time seemed to move differently. "How did you find all these places?" Isla asked, as they sat on a bench in the secret garden, sharing a bag of pralines from a vendor who knew Adrian by name. "I was lonely," he said simply. "When I first moved here, I worked 16-hour days and came home to an empty house. On weekends, I'd walk for hours, trying to understand what it was about this city that called to people. Eventually, I realized Charleston doesn't reveal itself to tourists or people in a hurry. It only opens up for people who are willing to get lost." "And did you get lost?" "Completely." He looked at her, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Until recently. I thought that was the only way I knew how to exist." They walked to Rainbow Row next, the famous stretch of colorful historic houses that appeared on every Charleston postcard. But Adrian led her to a small side street behind the tourist attraction, where the view was just as beautiful, but infinitely more private. "This is where I come when I need to think," he said, settling onto a stone wall that overlooked a small courtyard garden. "When deals go bad or board meetings get contentious, or the world feels too complicated. What do you think about when you're here?" "Lately? You?" The admission hit her like a physical force. "Adrian, I know we're moving fast," he said, turning to face her, I know this doesn't make logical sense. 3 weeks ago, I didn't even believe in what we're doing here. What are we doing here? Falling in love, he said simply, as if stating an obvious fact. Terrifying, illogical, completely unprecedented falling in love. Isla felt her breath catch. There it was, the words they'd been dancing around for days, finally spoken aloud in the bright Charleston sunshine. I know, she whispered. Do you? Because I need you to understand something. Adrian stood up, pacing a few steps before turning back to her. I've built my entire adult life around control and predictability and clear boundaries. What I feel for you threatens all of that. I'm not asking you to change who you are, but you are changing who I am, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Every conversation, every look, every moment I spend with you makes me want things I swore I'd never want again, makes me believe in possibilities I gave up on years ago. Isla stood up too, closing the distance between them. What kind of possibilities? A life that's about more than just achievement, a future that includes someone else's dreams alongside my own. The possibility that loving someone doesn't have to mean losing yourself. It might mean finding parts of yourself you never knew existed, and that scares you. It terrifies me, he admitted, because if I let myself want this, want you, completely, and it doesn't work out, then we'll deal with that if it happens, Isla said firmly. But Adrian, what if it does work out? What if we're brave enough to try and it's everything we never dared to hope for? He reached for her hands, interlacing their fingers. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is simple. Maybe we've been making it complicated because we're both used to protecting ourselves from exactly this. They stood in the hidden courtyard, surrounded by the sounds of Charleston life continuing around them. Carriages carrying tourists passed on the main street, church bells marking the hour, the distant call of seagulls from the harbor. But Isla felt as if they existed in their own bubble of possibility, balanced on the edge of everything changing. There's going to be an event tomorrow night, Adrian said suddenly. A charity gala for the Preservation Society. I'm expected to attend. Okay. I want you to come with me. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. This wasn't just an invitation to a party. It was Adrian asking her to step into his public life, to be seen with him by the people who comprised his professional and social world. As your photographer, she asked carefully. As the woman I'm falling in love with, he said, the words coming out raw and honest. I want to stop hiding this, stop pretending that what we have is casual or temporary. I want Charleston to know that Adrian Vale is completely, irrevocably, impossibly in love with Isla Montgomery. Her heart hammered against her ribs. That's a big step. It's a terrifying step, he corrected. But I'm tired of being afraid. You said we should be brave together. This is me trying to be brave. Isla looked into his eyes and saw fear and hope and love all tangled together. She thought about the careful life she'd built, the walls she'd maintained, the safety of keeping her heart protected. And then she thought about the woman she became when she was with him, braver, more honest, more herself than she'd ever been. Yes, she said simply. Yes, yes, I'll go with you. Yes, I want to stop hiding this too. Yes, I'm ready to be brave with you. Relief and joy, and something that looked like wonder, crossed Adrian's face. He pulled her closer, until there was no space between them, until she could feel his heart beating against her chest. Isla, he said, her name a prayer and a promise. I know, she whispered back, understanding without words that tomorrow night would change everything. For better or worse, they were about to find out exactly what they meant to each other. And for the first time in her life, the unknown felt less like a threat and more like the most beautiful adventure she'd ever been brave enough to begin. There are nights when the universe holds its breath, waiting to see if two people will be brave enough to choose love over fear. The Charleston Preservation Society's annual gala transformed the historic Gibby's Museum into something from a fairy tale. Soft lights twinkled among Spanish moss draping from the ceiling, while Charleston's elite moved through the galleries in elegant evening wear, champagne glasses catching the glow of carefully placed spotlights. The air hummed with the quiet conversations of old money and older secrets, the kind of event where fortunes were discussed over canapes and political alliances were forged between courses. Isla stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the deep emerald dress she'd chosen. Something elegant but not trying too hard, sophisticated but still unmistakably her. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened her grandmother's pearl earrings, the same ones she'd worn to their first real conversation at the cafe. Tonight felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump without knowing if there would be solid ground or endless sky on the other side. The knock at her door came at exactly 7:30. Adrian stood in her hallway wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that made him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine, except for his eyes, which held the same nervous energy she felt coursing through her own veins. "You look," he started, then stopped, shaking his head with a smile that was pure wonder. "Beautiful doesn't begin to cover it. You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from his lapel and trying to calm the butterflies staging a full-scale revolt in her stomach. "Ready for this?" he asked, offering his arm. "As ready as someone can be for voluntarily walking into the lion's den." "Hey," Adrian stopped, turning to face her fully. "If at any point tonight you want to leave, just say the word. No questions asked." "Adrian, I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "We're in this together, remember?" Something shifted in his expression, relief mixed with determination. "Together," he repeated, as if cementing a pact. The ride to the museum passed in comfortable quiet, their hands intertwined on the seat between them. Through the car windows, Charleston glided by in its evening finery, gas lamps flickering to life, couples strolling hand in hand toward dinner reservations, the city preparing for another night of southern charm and carefully maintained traditions. But as they pulled up to the museum's entrance, where photographers waited to capture the arriving guests, Isla felt Adrian's hand tighten around hers. "Second thoughts?" she asked softly. "1,000 of them," he admitted. "But not about you. Never about you." They stepped out of the car into a symphony of camera flashes and murmured recognition. Isla heard Adrian's name ripple through the crowd of onlookers. "Is that Adrian Vale? Who's the woman with him? I've never seen him bring a date before." Adrian's hand found the small of her back, steady and reassuring as they moved through the gauntlet of social curiosity. But Isla noticed the way his jaw tightened, the careful mask sliding into place as they entered his public world. Inside the museum, the transformation was complete. Charleston's Preservation Society had outdone themselves, turning the galleries into an elegant wonderland where art and society mingled in carefully orchestrated harmony. Adrian was immediately surrounded by the kind of people Isla had only read about in the society pages: old Charleston families, visiting dignitaries, business leaders whose decisions shaped the city's future. "Adrian," a woman in her 60s approached, dripping in diamonds and authority, "we were beginning to think you'd forgotten how to attend social functions." "Mrs. Rutledge," Adrian replied smoothly, falling back into his public persona. "Allow me to introduce Isla Montgomery." "Isla, this is Catherine Rutledge, president of the Preservation Society." "Pleasure to meet you," Isla said, extending her hand. "Mrs." Rutledge's appraising gaze took in everything from Isla's dress to her jewelry to the way Adrian's hand remained protectively at her back. "Montgomery, are you one of the Savannah Montgomerys?" "I'm afraid not," Isla replied with a smile. "Just a photographer from Charleston." A photographer. The words carried just enough emphasis to suggest this was not quite what Mrs. Rutledge had expected from Adrian's companion. For the next hour, Isla watched Adrian navigate the complex social choreography of Charleston high society. He was masterful at it, charming without being effusive, engaged without being overly familiar, commanding respect through presence rather than performance. But she could see the effort it required, the way he seemed to retreat behind a polished facade that grew thicker with each interaction. They were examining a Civil War-era painting when Douglas Whitman approached, a man Isla recognized from newspaper photos as Adrian's biggest business rival, someone who'd been trying to acquire Adrian's company for years. "Adrian, old friend," Whitman said with a kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Enjoying the evening?" "Douglas." Adrian's voice carried a coolness that made Isla unconsciously step closer to his side. "And this must be the photographer everyone's been talking about." Whitman's gaze lingered on Isla in a way that made her skin crawl. "Tell me, dear, how does someone in your profession find herself in such elevated company?" The insult was wrapped in enough politeness to be deniable, but its intent was clear. Isla felt Adrian tense beside her, saw his hand curl into a fist at his side. "Actually," Isla said with a smile that could have cut glass, "I find that elevated company tends to seek me out. Funny how that works." "Indeed." Whitman's smile turned predatory. "Though I have to wonder what Adrian's board of directors would think about their CEO getting distracted by temporary diversions." "That's enough," Adrian said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "Is it? Because from where I stand, it looks like Adrian Vale is finally showing his true colors. Tell me, Isla, has he explained how he treats people once he's tired of them? How quickly yesterday's obsession becomes tomorrow's liability? Stop. Adrian's voice was low and dangerous. The architect in Savannah could tell you all about Adrian's loyalty, or perhaps his former partner, who thought they had a handshake agreement until Adrian decided there was more profit in betrayal. I said stop. Adrian's control finally snapped, his voice cutting through the elegant murmur of conversation around them. Several guests turned to stare, and Isla felt the weight of dozens of curious gazes. Whitman's smile was triumphant. There's the real Adrian Vale. I was wondering when he'd show up. The silence that followed was deafening. Isla watched Adrian's face cycle through emotions, rage, humiliation, and finally, a kind of resigned defeat that broke her heart. He was retreating, she realized, pulling back behind walls that were higher and thicker than any she'd seen before. Excuse me, Adrian said stiffly and walked away, leaving Isla standing alone with Whitman's satisfied smile and the uncomfortable attention of Charleston's elite. But Isla didn't follow him. Instead, she turned to face Whitman with a calm that surprised even her. "You know what I find interesting, Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed gallery. "What's that, dear?" "You just spent 5 minutes trying to tear down a man who built something you've been trying to buy for years, a man who employs 300 people in this city, who's donated millions to historic preservation, who's never once in my presence said an unkind word about anyone, including you." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more powerful than shouting. "That tells me everything I need to know about both of you." She found Adrian on the museum's back terrace, standing alone at the railing that overlooked the garden. His bow tie was undone, hanging loose around his neck, and his hands gripped the stone balustrade so tightly his knuckles were white. "Adrian," she said softly, "you should go." His voice was flat, defeated. "This was a mistake. I was a mistake. Look at me." When he didn't respond, she moved to stand directly in front of him. "Look at me, Adrian." Reluctantly, he raised his eyes to hers, and she saw a pain there that made her chest ache. "Do you believe what he said?" she asked. "It doesn't matter what I believe. You heard him. You saw how they looked at us. At you. This is my world, Isla. This is what loving me means, dealing with people like Whitman, being judged and found wanting by people who think they know what you deserve. And what do you think I deserve? Better," he said without hesitation. "So much better than what I can give you." Isla reached up to cup his face in her hands, forcing him to maintain eye contact. "Adrian Vale, you listen to me. What I deserve is someone who sees me, really sees me, and chooses me anyway. Someone who makes me laugh and challenges me to be braver than I thought possible. Someone who shares Sunday morning coffee and lets me wear his shirts and isn't afraid to show me his broken places because he trusts me with them. Isla, what I deserve," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "is someone who loves me enough to fight for us, even when it's hard. Even when people like Douglas Whitman try to poison what we have with their own bitterness and insecurity. You don't understand, he was right about some things. I have made mistakes, I have hurt people. I am exactly the kind of man who what? Who's human? Who's made mistakes and learned from them? Who's spent years protecting himself because he was afraid of exactly this kind of vulnerability?" She leaned closer, her thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling down his cheeks. "Adrian, I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to be real. I need you to be mine." Something cracked in his expression, the last of his defenses crumbling in the face of her unwavering certainty. "I love you," she whispered, the words finally free after weeks of dancing around them. "I love your careful morning coffee rituals and the way you remember every detail of conversations we had weeks ago. I love how you bought flowers for Dolores and how you've never once tried to change me or fix me or make me into someone I'm not. I love the man you are when you're not performing for people who don't deserve your authenticity." "Isla," her name was a broken prayer on his lips. "Say it," she demanded gently. "Say what you're feeling, not what you think you should feel, not what's logical or safe, what's true." Adrian's hands came up to cover hers where they rested against his face. "I love you," he said, the words raw and honest and devastating in their simplicity. "I love you so much it terrifies me. I love you enough to want to be the man you see when you look at me. I love you enough to fight for this, for us, even when the world tells us we don't make sense." "Then fight," she said firmly. "Choose me, choose us, choose love over fear. What if I mess this up? Then we'll figure it out together. That's what love is, Adrian. Not a guarantee that everything will be perfect, but a promise to keep choosing each other, especially when it's hard. He kissed her then right there on the terrace with Charleston spread out below them and the sound of the gala continuing behind them. It was a kiss that tasted like promises and possibility, like two people finally brave enough to stop running from the very thing they'd been searching for all along. When they broke apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard. "I love you, Isla Montgomery," he said again as if testing the words on his tongue. "I love you too, Adrian Vale," she replied. "Now what do you say we go back in there and show Charleston exactly what love looks like when it refuses to be ashamed of itself?" Adrian's smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and full of infinite possibility. "Lead the way." And as they walked back into the gala hand in hand, heads held high and hearts wide open, they both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is love someone completely, publicly, unapologetically, and trust that love is strong enough to weather any storm. 6 months later, some stories end with grand gestures and dramatic declarations. Others end with quiet Sunday mornings and the simple miracle of choosing each other again. Isla woke to the sound of rain against the windows and the scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen below. The bedroom, their bedroom now, was painted in the soft grey light of a Charleston winter morning, when the city wrapped itself in mist and moved at a gentler pace. Through the window, she could see the harbour, calm and silvery, with a few brave pelicans gliding through the drizzle. 6 months, half a year since that night at the museum when they'd chosen love over fear, publicity over privacy, together over safe. The aftermath hadn't been without its challenges. There had been newspaper articles about Adrian's mystery photographer, board meetings where his personal life became a topic of discussion, and social events where some of Charleston's elite still whispered behind raised champagne glasses. But there had also been Sunday morning coffee rituals that extended into lazy afternoons, late-night conversations that started with work and ended with dreams, and the gradual, beautiful process of two independent lives learning to become one shared story without losing their individual chapters. The shirt she reached for was one of Adrian's, a habit that had started that rainy night months ago and had somehow become a permanent feature of her morning routine. It smelled like him and coffee and the jasmine that grew wild in their garden, a scent combination that had become synonymous with home. She found him in the kitchen, already dressed for his morning run, but distracted by something on his phone. He looked up when she appeared, and that smile, the one reserved only for her, spread across his face like sunrise. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, setting down his phone to wrap his arms around her. "Morning. What's got you so absorbed this early?" She nodded toward his abandoned device. "Remember that architect I told you about? The one from Savannah? The one you—" She paused, understanding immediately. "Marcus Hoffman. He wants to meet. Says he's been following our recent projects and thinks there might be room for collaboration." Adrian's voice carried a note of wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe it. "Apparently Dolores tracked him down and told him some story about how love had made me a better man, and maybe it was time for old wounds to heal." Isla laughed, picturing Adrian's housekeeper making peacekeeping phone calls with the determination of a diplomatic envoy. "And what did you tell him?" "That I'd be honored to buy him lunch and apologize for being an arrogant ass 5 years ago." "Character growth looks good on you, Mr. Vale." "Ms. Montgomery. Everything looks good on me when you're around." They moved through their morning routine with the easy choreography of people who had learned each other's rhythms. Adrian prepared her coffee, while Isla toasted the bread they'd bought from yesterday's farmer's market. He read her relevant sections from the newspaper while she planned her shooting schedule for the week, small domesticities that had somehow become the foundation of something extraordinary. "I have something for you," Adrian said as they settled at the kitchen table with their breakfast. "It's not my birthday. It's not that kind of gift." He handed her a manila envelope, thick with papers. "Open it." Inside, Isla found architectural drawings, detailed plans for a space she recognized as the empty storefront on King Street that she'd admired during one of their weekend walks. "Adrian," she said slowly, "what is this?" "Your studio," he said simply. "I know you've been talking about expanding beyond wedding photography, maybe doing more portrait work, teaching classes. This space has perfect natural light, room for a darkroom if you want to explore film photography, and enough space for students." Isla stared at the drawings, seeing her dreams translated into blueprints and possibility. You bought me a building? I bought us a future, he corrected gently. One where you don't have to edit photos in coffee shops because you have a space designed specifically for your art. One where I get to watch you build something beautiful from the ground up. Tears pricked at her eyes. Not sad tears, but the kind that came from being seen and supported and loved so completely that it still sometimes took her breath away. There's one more thing, Adrian continued, pulling out a smaller envelope from his jacket pocket. Adrian, you can't just keep... It's not from me, he interrupted. It came in yesterday's mail. The return address was from a gallery in New York, one of the prestigious photography venues she'd admired from afar but never dreamed of approaching. With trembling fingers, she opened the letter. Dear Ms. Montgomery, we recently had the opportunity to view your portfolio, specifically your series, Charleston Intimacies, candid moments of love and connection captured in everyday settings. We would be honored to feature your work in our upcoming exhibition American Love Stories, opening this fall. How did they... Isla began, then looked at Adrian's carefully neutral expression. You submitted my work? I may have suggested they take a look, he admitted. But Isla, they chose your photographs because they're extraordinary, because you have a gift for seeing beauty in ordinary moments, for capturing the truth of human connection in ways that make people feel less alone in the world. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she held the letter that represented validation she'd never dared to hope for. Why? She whispered. Because I love you, Adrian said simply. Because watching you create is like watching magic happen. Because you've taught me that love isn't about protecting each other from the world. It's about helping each other become the people we're meant to be. Isla set down the letter and moved around the table to settle in his lap, her arms wrapping around his neck. I love you too, she said against his lips, even when you make grand gestures that make me cry before I've had enough caffeine. Especially then, he murmured, kissing her softly. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and Charleston settled into the rhythm of another peaceful morning. But inside their kitchen, with architectural dreams spread across the table and New York possibilities glowing in the morning light, two people who had found their way to each other against all odds held each other close and marveled at the life they were building together. Later, they would go for their run along the waterfront, where pelicans still glided over the Ashley River, and the sunrise painted everything in shades of gold and possibility. They would stop at the farmer's market for fresh bread and flowers, sharing smiles with vendors who had watched their love story unfold in real time. They would spend the afternoon in their garden, where Dolores's wild beauty continued to bloom, and where they had learned that the best conversations happened with dirt under their fingernails and jasmine perfuming the air. But for now, they simply sat together in their kitchen, surrounded by dreams taking shape and love that had grown from tentative possibility into unshakable certainty. They were no longer two people afraid of falling in love. They were two people who had learned that the best kind of love wasn't about falling at all. It was about rising together, day after day, choice after choice, into the infinite possibility of a shared life. And as the rain softened to mist and Charleston awakened around them, Isla and Adrian Vale, because yes, she had taken his name, along with his heart and his future, understood that some love stories don't end with happily ever after. They end with happily ever during, the daily choice to love and be loved, to build and dream and grow together, to find magic in ordinary moments and strength in each other's arms. Because the best love stories aren't about finding your perfect match. They're about becoming perfect for each other, one sunrise at a time. The end. What moments in your own life have taught you that love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone worth growing with? Have you ever experienced a love that changed who you thought you were meant to be? Your participation in the channel is very important, so please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.